Hello, hello. Welcome back to another installment of English 101. We are going to continue where we left off last time. Again, from the home page, we could use the modules view and scroll down to module 1. From the home page, this link sitemap will also take you to a rather boring looking but condensed version of the 4 modules around the 4 essays and the final. The introduction module is a bit abbreviated here at the top. So we looked last time at the overview and the introduction. On that page, I'm going to collapse the sidebar and zoom in quite a bit on the size of the text. Down below, this long first video and a whole bunch of notes on getting started with the course. There are some quotes from the last chapter that I would like to talk about with you today. And this is what I was calling some of the good news of the book, and that's why I think we should take a look at the last chapter at the beginning of the semester. There are several books and lots of people talking online about dopamine these days, and also things like cell phone clicking. Us positively and negatively. I don't know if you've heard about people's and cell phones affecting sleep and other sorts of brain patterns in a lot of negative ways. And many of the text and go ahead and say YouTube videos talking about the subject talk about trying to reduce or remove ourselves from the kinds of situations that produce nervous stress, anxiety, and counterproductive behavior is the way I'm going to say it right now. But one of the parts of this book that I is some of these ideas here. And I know that video up at the top of this page went on in quite a long amount of detail. I didn't expect anyone to, again, didn't expect any one person to use all of that material. And similarly here below, with essay 1, you're going to be looking for a couple quotes. So already on the screen, there are plenty more than any one person is going to need. I went through the last chapter and condensed not only some of the interesting individual quotes, but also the conclusion to the entire book in some ways. So we have in some ways talked about the bad news of dopamine. And this quote here, a person can be disabled by both focus on the and an enjoyment of the present. Jump down to a couple to lead to production misery, the workaholic executive. And the earlier chapters will talk about what I'm going to call here the bad news. And the introduction explained that in this book, H and N refers to here and now, and a set of neurotransmitters related to what the introduction called the here and now, the nearby, the present. And too much H and N can lead to an excessive enjoyment of the present, happy indolence, the pot-smoking basement dweller. So 2 extremes unpleasant extremes, and dopamine and H and N will be explained in much more detail throughout the book, which is probably not a big surprise. And as that first video and the notes above talk about, you're welcome to look into this in as much or as little detail as you find interesting for your own purposes. For example, right down below, he says, everybody already knows something about this. We instinctively know that neither extreme is healthy. So that's the general way. We're all welcome to think about this in a non-technical fashion, if you like it that way. Or for those of you who do find the comparison to Macbeth and the literature interesting metaphorically, that is another way to think about the world. And you can see, if you're looking at the screen, that I took out the example of the movie that the author is talking about in that sentence. He goes on to an opposite example with a different film to exemplify the other extreme. This is, again, what I would call the bad news, that dopamine alone will never satisfy us. It can't provide satisfaction any more than a hammer can turn a screw, but it's, again, this may sound pretty familiar to those of you who have been looking at the effects of internet on happiness, or internet, what some people are even calling addiction, for the bad that constant satisfaction is around the corner. One test, conquest, or contest, one more click, 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 click. Level 735 of 10,023. And a lot of the bad news that I hear stops right there. It doesn't go on, not only to talk about doing something, but the good side of things too. And the last chapter talks in some way, it's called balance, but it talks to some extent on the concept of mastery, getting really good at something. And I really found this part interesting here, that from dopamine's point of view, mastery is something good, something to be. We'll talk these chapters with some technical terms and extraction success. If you want to look that up right now, go ahead. Otherwise, let's keep achieving dopamine. When mastery is achieved, dopamine has reached the pinnacle of its aspiration, squeezing every last drop out of an available resource. Having done all it can do, dopamine pauses and allows H&N to have its way with our happiness circuits. And the earlier chapters will talk about control dopamine and desire dopamine circuits in much more detail. Even if it's only for a short time, dopamine doesn't fight that feeling of contentment, it approves. So how do we get off the treadmill of wanting more, but never feeling happy? Actually getting good at something is one way, or part of it. And there's some other good news to follow. Mastery also creates a feeling of locus of control. This is a term from psychology that you can find quite a bit of literature on, going back many years, and not related so much to the technical aspects of neurotransmitters that Lieberman is talking about here. But the idea that I once heard described as how some people feel as if they are a leaf blown by the wind through life. That is a low locus of control, or an external locus of control, a low feeling of an internal locus of control. An internal locus of control is, as highlighted there on the screen, the tendency to view one's choices as experiences as being under one's own control. So the decisions we make have consequences, good and bad, and it's not luck, fate, or other people that lead us down the path we follow in life, but our own free will. That right here is plainly described as something that makes people feel good. I've always heard it as not two different options in life, but that some of us feel at different times in different ways more responsible for our actions and decisions, to put it in a rather strict sounding way, or understanding the effect of the environment. So that starts to get a little bit into nature and nurture, another big complicated aspect of things. Let's keep going. So the internal locus of control, the development of an internal locus of control, as well as making at least some of us who like to live our lives that way and like thinking about it. Not everybody does, and not everybody has to, is what I was trying to say before in that long pause. But for those of us who do want one and want to live our lives as if our choices are our own, can find not only contentment and feelings, particular things work when our decisions lead to success, of course. And with this, in the context of these ideas, even if dopamine only takes a pause to enjoy an accomplishment before it starts to encourage us to move on to the next, that is part of what does encourage us to keep putting in that time and effort, going beyond our current level. A book that many people read around 10 years ago was Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and many people who didn't necessarily read the book talked about the idea of 10,000 hours of practice to get really good at something. It is a lot of work to get really good at something, and that's, to me, interesting in this context. So again, a lot of the bad news of dopamine in the context of this book focuses on some of the negative aspects of desire dopamine circuitry activation. And some of the good news here in this is talking about what Lieberman calls the control dopamine circuits. And here again is part of why something that is related to feeling good is also part of what can lead to unhappiness and anxiety in sort of a self-feedback loop, that dopamine makes sure that the surprise that felt so good before will never be a surprise. Distinguishes own pleasure. A general expression of more technical descriptions of how the neurotransmitters attach and the reuptake process that will be described in some detail. But again, you are welcome to stay general if you like, or look into that if you find it interesting. And this is an interesting idea as well to me. It's frustrating that the surprise that felt so good will never be such a good feeling surprise again. But in his analysis here, it's the best way to keep us alive. What can we do to keep the surprises coming? No ... in between here. It seems like, to me, there's a lot to be thought and said about if that's the best way to keep us alive as a species. But that's a pretty big, heavy idea that covers a lot of history. And for some of us, what can we do to keep the surprises coming? Like right now, for me, some of us might want to focus on that anyway. Reality is the richest source of the unexpected. This idea, to me, I found really interesting as well. Paying attention to the here and now sounds like a lecture to me from Zazen Buddhism. The line, paying attention to reality, to what you are actually doing in the moment, maximizes the amount of information flowing to your brain, connects those general ideas of philosophy and meditation to the neurotransmitter discussion in this book in ways that I've never heard before. That's part of what I find interesting in this book, is putting together the general ideas that I think a lot of us have thought about with some of the contemporary research in neurotransmission. Here's a brief description of a study that showed people pictures of nature in between tests that required concentration, and that's what it says. If this sounds strange or unusual to you, the people who looked at a picture of flowers and grass between the tests made fewer errors. This is one study, as talked about in the book and in the previous video. One study does not create theory. It's a tiny part of theory building, but the text's use of this word speculate also emphasizes that idea in a condensed version, that the researchers decided that what happened in their test was that looking at the picture of the natural scene stimulated both subcortical arousal, or the desire dopamine circuits, and cortical attention control dopamine circuits, or connecting the here and now to the desire for the future. But putting these two together. Now, the next word, multitasking, putting two things, doing two things at the same time, is different. Not working together like brakes and gas, as described in an earlier chapter. Race car drivers, I've been thinking, often roar up to a turn, slam on the brakes, and then stomp on the gas again halfway through as they exit the turn. So that's a little bit different than doing two different things at once. And here again, I'm happy to see he goes ahead and uses the word impossible. Research, et cetera, as described a minute ago. Science doesn't so much prove things as support theories, but I kind of like that he encourages us to think of it as just plain impossible. Instead of increasing your efficiency, so-called multitasking decreases it. This is something my dad always taught me when I was young. Make more mistakes when you try, end up taking twice as long, and the mistakes are sometimes extremely costly. I found this idea interesting, related to both computers and thrash metal, is the expression I'll use right here. When a computer is what a lot of us called crashed, what may be happening is that it is thrashing, or trying to switch back and forth between complicated jobs and getting so little done on each attempt that it ends up spending more time trying to switch back and forth between the jobs than it ever seems to get anything done. So it's actually sitting there busily bouncing And to us, it looks like it's frozen, but it just isn't making much progress. It's turning back and forth from job to job more than it's making much progress. I've found myself doing that sometimes, standing with two different objects, one in each hand, trying to do something in two different ways and physically turning back and forth between the two jobs and not working on either one. That is what I find interesting here. You are not required to believe it. Thank you for your patience. I told you this one was going to be shorter than the other, but this is some of the stuff that I find really interesting in this book. And you are welcome to pause, fast forward, or hit the stop button whenever you please this way. What does he recommend then? Not only the mastery, but the making of new things. The creativity is by definition surprising. And creation is the most durable of the dopaminergic pleasures. What kind? Putting our hands and our heads together. They don't have playing music here. They don't have gardening. They don't have auto mechanics, but putting our brains and our hands together where our imagination conceives a project, our controlled dopamine circuits help us make a plan to achieve the future. And then in the real here and now physical world, we actually see something as a result. Again, this is stuff that you are welcome to think about in general ways or in as much technical detail as you find interesting. One study looked at 30,000 employees and decided that the happiest people were construction workers. Don't know if or painters or need. But here again, the idea is abstract plans made real, using their minds and their hands. He also talks about how they have a lot of camaraderie and feel like they work with friends, and that doesn't hurt either. This is about the end of the book, that our dopamine circuits make us human, for better and worse. They can lead us to desire some of the big ideas that have been considered the great achievements of the geniuses in our past that we've built upon and aspired toward, but they can also lead us down a path of addiction, betrayal, and misery. We have to overcome the seduction of endless dopaminergic stimulation. Maybe you heard a long time ago the test where they gave rats the ability to push a button and either get a drug or stimulate their brains directly with electricity, and they would do that until they starved to death or went without water. What's that word called? Dehydrated. And what do we do to achieve not only some satisfaction, but some accomplishments as well, to put them both together? Yay! Balance and harmony. Sensory reality and abstract thought working together to unlock our brain's full potential, producing not only happiness and satisfaction, but a rich mixture of sensory experience and wise understanding. Thanks, everyone. I hope you find some of these quotes not only useful for your essay, but interesting to compare to your life and your career plans as well. Feel free to send me any questions or comments. You will see in the next steps, you will be for essay 1, choosing a couple quotes from the beginning and the end of the book, talking it over with some others, sort of like I've been doing with you here in this video, and deciding what you think about it all. That's essay 1, 3 pages. Let me know if you need more help. Thanks, everyone.